In the quiet deserts of the northern Sinai, far from the political centers of Jerusalem and Samaria, there was once a small place built for passing through. Not a city, not a fortress, more like a way station, perched on a hill near water sources, sitting at the crossroads of desert routes. Travelers came through, messengers came through, merchants came through, and sometimes people who could write came through too. This is important, because the most explosive clues about early Israelite religion did not come from a royal archive or a temple library. They came from ordinary portable surfaces. Plaster on walls, ink on pottery, a few lines written quickly, casually, like a blessing you would send with someone who is leaving, or a prayer you would leave behind for protection. The site is called Kuntillet Ajrud. Archaeologists excavated it in the mid-1970s under Zeev Michel, and what they found dated to the late 9th or early 8th century BCE, with radiocarbon work clustering the site's activity in the early 8th century BCE. Kuntillet Ajrud sits about 50 kilometers south of Kadesh Barnea, overlooking Wadi Koraya, positioned near an intersection of several ancient desert routes. It is exactly the kind of place where people would stop, rest, refill water, exchange news, and leave marks behind. Some scholars think it functioned as a hostelry rather than a formal shrine, because the architecture and pottery do not look like a dedicated temple complex. But the inscriptions complicate that picture, because the words on the walls and jars are not purely administrative. They are religious. They invoke divine names. They bless people in the name of gods. And this is where the story cracks open. Among the most studied inscriptions are those written on large storage jars, pithoi, found at the site. One blessing, written on what scholars call pithos A, reads in translation, "I bless you by Yahweh of Samaria and by his Asherah." That phrase, Yahweh of Samaria, already tells us something. It suggests a world where people could speak of Yahweh in a regional way, Yahweh associated with a place, a political center, a particular community. This is not the later simplified version most people grow up with, where Yahweh is only imagined as a universal solitary deity with a single authorized center of worship. Here, the language feels local, lived, and grounded. But what shook scholars was not only Yahweh of Samaria, it was the next part, and by his Asherah. The phrase shows up again in a similar blessing on another jar, often called Pithos B, where the text reads like the opening of a letter, a greeting, a check-in, then a blessing. I bless you by Yahweh of Teman and by his Asherah. May he bless you and keep you and be with my Lord. Now we have a second place name, Teman, which is often understood as a region associated with Edom, or at minimum the south, a southern land. It widens the picture. We are not looking at one isolated odd phrase. We are seeing a repeated formula, used more than once, invoking Yahweh with a place and linking him to his Asherah. So what does his Asherah mean? This is where interpretation becomes careful and honest scholarship stays humble. The grammar allows debate. Some have argued it could refer to a sacred object, perhaps a wooden cult symbol, something like a pole or stylized tree associated with Asherah, rather than the goddess herself. Others argue the phrase points beyond an object and that it preserves a memory of Asherah as a divine figure linked to Yahweh in popular religion. Even within scholarship that leans toward the cult object interpretation, the key point remains. The Asherah is functioning in these blessings as something connected to Yahweh and involved in blessing. And that is not small, because these are not curses, they are not condemnations, they are not polemics, they are positive blessings, written in a tone of normalcy, like the writer assumes the reader will understand exactly what is meant. Kuntillet Ajrud also complicates things visually. The jars include drawings of animals and symbolic motifs, and also human-like figures. Some early interpretations tried to connect the drawings to the words, imagining the images as depictions of Yahweh and Asherah. But detailed study has shown that the inscriptions and drawings do not neatly align. In some cases, the writing overlaps the drawings, suggesting they were added at different times, and the figures are more plausibly connected to protective imagery like the Egyptian god Bes, rather than a direct portrait of Israel's god and a consort. So the power of Kuntillet Ajrud is not that it gives us a clean, museum-label answer. It is that it gives us a real-world snapshot of religion as people actually practiced it. Messy, regional, layered. carrying older traditions forward while new ideologies were forming. Then there is the second site, farther north in the hill country of Judah, Khirbet el Qom. Here, the evidence is not on a storage jar in a desert outpost. It is in a burial context, carved into stone, associated with a tomb inscription and a carved hand symbol that many interpret as protective. The text is difficult and has been debated, but a widely cited reading includes a blessing for a man named Uriyahu, and the key phrase appears again, tied to deliverance and protection. Blessed be Uriyahu by Yahweh, for from his enemies by his Asherah he has saved him. Even in this setting, the logic is similar. Asherah, or his Asherah, is not framed as a shameful foreign temptation. It is part of how someone expressed divine protection. It sits inside a blessing formula. It is used in a way that assumes it belongs. And when you step back and look at these inscriptions together, something becomes hard to deny. Early Yahweh worship was not always presented as a solitary, sealed system. The biblical text we inherited was shaped through editing, reform movements, and theological battles, especially as power centralized and religious uniformity became a political goal. But these inscriptions preserve older layers, or at least parallel layers, where the divine world did not look so simple. Some scholars connect this to the wider Canaanite religious background, where El and Asherah appear as a high god and a queenly partner in earlier traditions. Others caution against importing second millennium myth directly into first millennium Israelite practice. Both cautions matter. Cultures transform, names shift, meanings evolve, but the resemblance is still striking, especially when we see Yahweh being invoked with language that echoes partnership and blessing through his Asherah. And that brings us to the real question. Why were these voices lost? Because religion is never only about devotion. It is also about control. It is about who gets to speak for God. It is about which practices are declared legitimate and which are declared dangerous. If the people were blessing each other by Yahweh and his Asherah, then a later system that demanded Yahweh alone would have to do more than remove objects. It would have to rewrite memory. And that rewriting left fingerprints. The Hebrew Bible mentions Asherim repeatedly, usually as something to be cut down, burned, destroyed. The polemics are so intense that they end up revealing what they are trying to erase. You do not launch a reform campaign against something that nobody cares about. You do not keep returning to the same target for generations if it has no hold on the people. So the inscriptions from Kuntillet Ajrud and Khirbet el Qom do not just add a footnote to history. They force a reframe. They tell us that early Israelite religion included forms of Yahweh worship that could coexist with a sacred feminine symbol and perhaps a sacred feminine figure in the religious imagination of ordinary people. And even if we remain cautious about exactly what his Asherah means in every single line, the combined picture is still clear enough to be unsettling. The world that produced these blessings was not a world where the divine feminine was always absent. It was a world where she could stand near the center, close enough to be invoked in everyday speech, close enough to be written in ink on a jar in a desert way station. Belief evolves. It expands and contracts. It gets edited and recast, but it leaves traces. Sometimes those traces are not buried in a library. Sometimes they are waiting on a broken piece of pottery under sand and stone until someone lifts it into the light. And when they do, the silence breaks.